Great. Well, here we are. Thank you so much for joining me, Lucy. It's Louisa Lockwood from Preach magazine in conversation with Lucy Peppiatt, discussing your new book, Lucy, Unveiling Paul's Women. And you focused in particular on a passage in 1 Corinthians 11, verses 2 to 16. And we're just going to talk a little bit about that and around the reasons for producing the book. And this is part of the Preach Book Club, where we can you can find more questions online and more information about the book there. But this is to kind of give you a taster of what's in the book and to hear from Lucy herself. So the first question is, what was it that struck you and held your attention to this particular passage? So many other people have worked around it and looked at it and done their research on it, but you've actually stuck with it and dug very deep into it.
Well, I think most of us who get caught by this passage actually do stick with it and really want to try and make sense of it, and it becomes really fascinating because of a number of different reasons. One is it's so difficult and elusive. It's difficult to work out what is actually being said and why, and the implications of what's been said in terms of why women should wear head coverings. So people who explore the passage want to get to the bottom of it, and to some extent it eludes us all the time, so we're always wrestling with it. But there was a deeper sense, I think, and that's because this passage for 2,000 years has been very, very influential in terms of how women are treated in church, in terms of the roles of ministry that are given to them. So it's taken on a huge importance in the role of women in the church, and so I think I had an added incentive really to try and work out what it actually means, because it is used as a controlling passage for church practice.
Absolutely, and I think there'll be many women who'll be very grateful to you for digging into this question and answering what would have probably felt very uncomfortable to them and discordant with the rest of the teaching of the Bible. So many questions that have been unanswered or unsatisfactorily answered for many decades. So you've been puzzling over it for quite a long time. And this book actually grew out of another piece of work you did, Women in Worship.
Yeah, so I wrote Women in Worship at Corinth first, and I wrote that book because I thought I had seen a pattern of Paul engaging with his Corinthian opponents, or the people at Corinth, the leaders at Corinth, who he knew who were engaged in practices that he disagreed with. Once I understood more fully that is something that Paul does as a writer, and especially I knew that he does do it in 1 Corinthians, but then as I researched it I began to discover that there are scholars who think that he has more extended passages of quoting or referring to his opponent's arguments. And so once I realised that is a possibility, as much as it's kind of been discounted by many scholars, it is a possibility. And then I saw a pattern in 11 to 14 in those 4 chapters where there are 3 occurrences of where I think this is happening. And so I wrote a book for academics, it's an academic book, on the patterns that I see in these 3 passages. And then after I had done that, I got badgered by a number of people to write something much simpler just on the head coverings issue, because that's the one that everyone comes back to over and over and over again.
Well, you've certainly achieved that, because it's a very short book. It's just 100 pages where you've distilled all your research, your conversations with other people. You've actually managed to distill people who've had opposing arguments to you about the theology and the language used in a very clear and concise and accessible way, and in a very honest way, because you've kept the opposing arguments in there, which allow people to formulate their own opinions based on the research that you've done. So you've sort of you've
Well,
drawn.
I hope so. I think it's important for people to make up their own minds, actually, and I think it's important for people to be aware of what is being said about the passage, and there are a number of different interpretations, and so we have a number of options on the table. But I hope that I've also demonstrated where some of the options aren't very satisfactory, and given people a chance to understand why they might still be confused by the explanation, even though the person themselves thinks that they've given a good one.
Absolutely. Did you find that difficult to do, to go back over the research you'd done? Once you'd worked out what it was with the passage that you thought was the correct interpretation, you describe your conversation with your husband and having that aha moment of, I know what it is that's the issue at Corinth. And as you do in the introduction to Unveiling Paul's Women, did you then find it quite difficult to go back and explain that with clarity in the book? Or
it was a bit like a game, I think, for me. It was a sort of intellectual game, so I enjoyed going over different people's arguments and trying to work out the premises that they were working with, the assumptions that they'd made. So I knew the assumptions I'd made already, and I knew what I had decided already and was bringing to the passage that I thought the passage was telling me. But obviously everyone thinks they've done that. So I quite enjoyed it, actually. It was taxing. Some people are very, very obscure and convoluted in the way that they describe what's going on in the passage, and really have an awful lot of assumptions underneath that they assume everyone else is going to adopt. And so I quite liked trying to dig those out and say they're pushing you in this direction because they've already decided it means that.
When you were doing your research for the book, did you have conversations with people that when you were describing your theology, they also had a moment of kind of recognition but also relief that they finally understood the complexity of this passage? And
yeah, I've had a range of different responses. So when I when I first started sharing it, it was with my systematic theologian colleagues, because I'm a systematic theologian and not a biblical scholar by training. So those were the people I went to first, and they were quite excited about the idea. I had one friend who I thought was going to grill me on my ideas, and instead of that he just said, "Oh, that totally makes sense." I said, he's a professor in systematic theology. So that made me laugh. I thought I was going to have to answer masses of questions. But then I did find myself sitting in front of Bible scholars having some great conversations, which I really enjoyed. I had an hour and a half with David Wenham, who's a great New Testament scholar, and he disagrees with me, so we had a really, really good conversation where I tried to get behind his thinking and tried to understand exactly what he saw in the passage, and he pushed me on a number of issues. The same thing happened. I found myself in front of Scott Hafeman, who's a New Testament scholar, a professor at St Andrews, and Scott McKnight, and there have been various people since then who I've had great conversations with. One of my conversations partners is Michael Lakey, who sees exactly the opposition in the passage from. So we see the same result in the passage, but he thinks it's Paul and I think it's not. So we've had some really good conversations, and in fact his book was extremely helpful to me in terms of getting the kind of clarity, because I think he has real clarity on what the passage is saying, and so he was enormously helpful to me in digging into the theology and the cosmology and the theology of gender that is inscribed in the passage.
I think that gives people a lot of confidence that they can read the book knowing you've had all these conversations, and that actually it's part of an ongoing conversation really within the church. And hopefully this was only published in 2018, sort of more accessible book about your research, and hopefully a lot more people will be able to come to it today and continue those conversations. So we hope that you'll get a lot more feedback.
I hope it's put a bit of a rock in the pond as well, of just unsettling people, because it is actually a very, very obscure passage, and the meaning of the passage, whichever way you cut it, does not give a good outcome for women. So that's one of the things I wanted to get underneath, and I hope that it causes a lot of people just to go back to it and think again and say what might be an interesting, satisfactory, more correct answer.
Well, that's the aim, so hopefully. What do you hope for next for the book?
For Women in Worship and Unveiling, I think just to keep the conversation open on the passage, so I don't think that we should foreclose on the meaning yet and say it definitely means this, because I don't think anyone has really got to the bottom of it particularly, or if they have, that the implications are so difficult that we haven't dealt with those. So I think the conversation just needs to carry on, really, and that's part of a wider conversation in terms of women's ministry in the church and women's position in marriage and in society, and various conversations that are ongoing in the church about the position of women.
Thank you, Lucy. Well, viewers of this, hopefully that was an invitation to you to get in touch with Lucy, and once you've read the book, and to share your ideas and reactions to the book too. Thank you.
Thanks.